Good evening and welcome back to my channel. On January 26th, the Pentagon released a document that just ended 75 years of American foreign policy. The 2026 National Defense Strategy officially declares that the United States will no longer be the world's policeman. China has been downgraded from America's #1 threat. Europe has been told to defend itself. And Taiwan, which China plans to invade by 2027, has been removed from the list of U.S. strategic priorities. This isn't a leak. This isn't speculation. This is official Pentagon doctrine signed by Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth and approved by President Trump, and the implications are staggering. For the first time since World War II, the United States has formally announced that it will prioritize its own hemisphere over defending allies in Europe and Asia. NATO members are panicking. Asian allies are scrambling to build up their militaries. And China is celebrating because the one country that could stop them from invading Taiwan just signaled it might not intervene. Let me be very clear about what this document says, because most media outlets are missing the most important parts. The 2026 National Defense Strategy states, quote, "The days of the United States propping up the entire world order like Atlas are over." It declares that America's top military priority is now defending the Western Hemisphere, not countering China in the Pacific. It explicitly states that Europe will be turned over to the Europeans to defend, with the United States in support. That last phrase is critical. In support. Not leading, not commanding, in support. If Russia attacks a NATO country, the U.S. might send weapons and intelligence. But American troops? That's no longer guaranteed. But here's what makes this even more shocking. China, which every U.S. national security strategy since 2017 has identified as the primary threat to American interests, has been downgraded to the #2 priority. The Pentagon's own document states that while China's military buildup is historic and concerning, the U.S. goal is no longer to dominate or strangle or humiliate them. Instead, the strategy emphasizes ongoing U.S. diplomacy with China and building a strong denial defense in the Pacific while urging allies to do more for our collective defense. The United States is telling Japan, South Korea, the Philippines, and Australia, "You're mostly on your own now. We'll help, but you need to spend more money and put more of your own troops on the front line." And here's the part that should terrify Taiwan. Taiwan is not mentioned once in the section on strategic priorities, not once. This is extraordinary because Chinese President Xi Jinping has ordered the People's Liberation Army to be ready to invade Taiwan by 2027. That deadline is 18 months away. U.S. intelligence agencies have confirmed this is real. Military analysts worldwide agree that a Taiwan invasion is the most likely flashpoint for World War III, and the 2026 National Defense Strategy barely mentions it. Compare that to previous strategies. The 2018 National Defense Strategy under the first Trump administration called Taiwan a vital U.S. interest and pledged to maintain military superiority in the region. The 2022 National Defense Strategy under Biden identified defending Taiwan as essential to preventing Chinese dominance in Asia. Now, silence. Defense officials told CSIS, a Washington think tank, that Taiwan is implied in the strategy's discussion of the Indo-Pacific. But implied is not the same as guaranteed, and China knows the difference. Beijing is watching this very carefully. And what they're seeing is that the United States just gave them a green light. Let me walk you through the 3 pillars of this new strategy, because each one represents a massive shift in how America projects power around the world. Pillar 1, hemispheric security. The 2026 National Defense Strategy states that the U.S. military's top priority is now defending the homeland and securing the Western Hemisphere. This is being called the Trump corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine, issued in 1823, declared that the United States would not tolerate European interference in the Americas. For 200 years, it was a warning to foreign powers. Stay out of our backyard. The Trump corollary goes much further. It declares that the United States will actively control the Western Hemisphere, from the Arctic to the southern tip of South America. Specifically, the strategy prioritizes U.S. access to 3 locations: Greenland, the Panama Canal, and the Gulf of Mexico. Let's talk about Greenland first. On January 17th, President Trump announced a 10% tariff on 8 European countries and threatened to raise it to 25% by June unless Denmark agrees to sell Greenland to the United States. Denmark has flatly refused. The European Union is preparing a $100 billion retaliatory trade package, but the 2026 National Defense Strategy makes clear that Trump is serious. The document explicitly lists Greenland as a strategic priority for rare earth minerals and Arctic military positioning. The Pentagon believes that whoever controls Greenland controls access to the Arctic, which is rapidly opening up due to climate change. Russia and China are both building military bases in the Arctic, and the United States wants to make sure it gets there first. Next, the Panama Canal. Trump has repeatedly threatened to retake control of the Panama Canal, which the U.S. ceded to Panama in 1999. He claims Panama is charging unfair fees and allowing too much Chinese influence over the canal's operations. The 2026 National Defense Strategy doesn't explicitly call for seizing the canal, but it does list access to strategic choke points as a top priority. And there's no more strategic choke point in the Western Hemisphere than the Panama Canal. Finally, Venezuela and the Gulf of Mexico. On January 3rd, the U.S. military executed Operation Absolute Resolve, capturing Venezuelan President Nicolas Maduro and flying him to New York to face drug trafficking charges. Over 100 people were killed in the operation. Trump has since declared that the United States will run Venezuela until a new government is in place. The 2026 National Defense Strategy formalizes this approach. It states that the U.S. military will be used to counter narco-terrorism and secure borders against illegal immigration. That's Pentagon language for using military force in Latin America. This is unprecedented. For the past 50 years, the United States has largely avoided direct military intervention in Latin America. There were exceptions: Operation Just Cause in Panama in 1989, small operations in Haiti, but nothing on the scale of what we're seeing now. The Trump administration is signaling that the Monroe Doctrine is back, and it will be enforced with overwhelming military power. Pillar 2, downgrading China and the Indo-Pacific. This is where the strategy gets really controversial. For the past decade, every major U.S. policy document has identified China as the primary threat to American interests. The reason is simple. China is building the most powerful military in Asia, it's militarizing the South China Sea, and it's threatening to invade Taiwan by force. The 2026 National Defense Strategy changes that calculus. China is still listed as a threat, but it's no longer the top threat. The strategy states that while the U.S. will maintain a military presence in the Pacific, the goal is not to dominate China or prevent its rise. Instead, the focus is on deterring conflict and getting allies to shoulder more of the defense burden. Let me give you the exact quote from the strategy. "We aim to be clear-eyed and realistic about the speed, scale, and quality of China's historic military buildup, but the goal is neither to dominate nor to strangle or humiliate them." That language is astonishing. Previous strategies explicitly aim to maintain U.S. military superiority over China. This strategy effectively concedes that China will continue to grow more powerful, and the U.S. will focus on managing that rise rather than stopping it. Here's what that means in practice. The United States currently has approximately 50,000 troops stationed in Japan, another 2,500 in South Korea, thousands more scattered across Guam, the Philippines, and Australia. The 2026 National Defense Strategy suggests that in the future, those numbers could shrink as the U.S. shifts resources to the Western Hemisphere. At the same time, the strategy urges Japan, South Korea, and other allies to dramatically increase their own defense spending. Japan is already planning to double its defense budget over the next 5 years. South Korea is building advanced missile systems and expanding its navy. Australia just announced it will acquire nuclear-powered submarines. But here's the problem. Even if all of those countries maximize their military capabilities, they still can't match China. The People's Liberation Army has 2 million active duty personnel. The Chinese Navy is now the largest in the world by number of ships. And China's defense budget is growing at roughly 7% per year. Japan's military is highly advanced, but constitutionally limited to self-defense. South Korea is focused on the threat from North Korea, not China. Australia has a population of only 26 million people. It simply doesn't have the manpower to project force across the Pacific. In other words, without the United States actively leading the defense of the Indo-Pacific, China becomes the dominant power in the region. And that's exactly what the 2026 National Defense Strategy is setting in motion. Pillar 3, Europe on its own. The most shocking section of the strategy deals with Europe and NATO. For 75 years, the United States has been the backbone of European security. American troops stationed in Germany, Poland, and the Baltics have served as a tripwire, guaranteeing that any Russian attack on a NATO country would trigger full U.S. military involvement. The 2026 National Defense Strategy changes that. The document states, quote, "Europe is turned over to the Europeans to defend, with the United States in support." That phrasing is deliberate. The U.S. is no longer promising to lead Europe's defense. It's promising to support Europe's defense. There's a massive difference. Defense Secretary Pete Hegseth made this even more explicit in his introduction to the strategy. He wrote, "No longer will the department be distracted by interventionism, endless wars, regime change, and nation building. If Russia invades a NATO country, don't expect American ground troops to show up on day one. Maybe the U.S. will send weapons. Maybe it will provide intelligence. But boots on the ground, that's Europe's job now." European leaders are absolutely panicking. Germany's defense minister called the strategy a wake-up call that Europe can no longer rely on American protection. France's President Macron has been pushing for a European army for years, and this strategy just gave him all the ammunition he needs. Poland is frantically trying to negotiate bilateral defense agreements with the United States outside of NATO. But here's the hard truth. Europe is not ready to defend itself. European NATO members collectively spend about $350 billion per year on defense. That sounds like a lot, but it's less than half of what the United States spends. And European militaries are fragmented. Germany has a strong army but a weak navy. France has a capable military but limited power projection. The UK is still rebuilding after decades of budget cuts. Could Europe defend itself against Russia without the United States? Maybe. Russia's military has been severely weakened by the war in Ukraine. It's lost hundreds of thousands of troops, thousands of tanks and armored vehicles, and much of its advanced missile stockpile. If the war ended tomorrow, it would take Russia years to rebuild. But that's not the scenario that worries European leaders. The real fear is that Russia wins in Ukraine, rebuilds its military with Chinese and North Korean support, and then probes NATO's eastern border to see if the alliance will actually respond. And if the United States has made clear that it's no longer leading NATO, Russia might decide to take that gamble. The 2026 National Defense Strategy also addresses one other issue that has been largely ignored by the media: nuclear arms control. The last remaining arms control treaty between the United States and Russia, New START, expires in February 2026. That's next month. New START limits the number of deployed strategic nuclear warheads that each country can have. The U.S. and Russia are each allowed 1,550 deployed warheads. The treaty also includes verification measures, allowing each side to inspect the other's nuclear facilities. Once New START expires, there will be no limits on the number of nuclear weapons either country can deploy, and there will be no verification system to track what the other side is building. The 2026 National Defense Strategy says almost nothing about this. It mentions nuclear modernization, a program to upgrade America's aging nuclear arsenal, but it doesn't address whether the U.S. will seek a new arms control agreement with Russia. It doesn't discuss the risks of an uncontrolled nuclear arms race. It just moves on. That silence is alarming. Without arms control, both the U.S. and Russia could deploy thousands of additional nuclear warheads. China, which currently has about 500 nuclear warheads, could expand its arsenal to match the U.S. and Russia. And smaller nuclear powers like North Korea, Pakistan, and India could feel pressure to build up their own stockpiles to maintain deterrence. In other words, the world could be heading toward a new nuclear arms race, and the 2026 National Defense Strategy doesn't even acknowledge it as a priority. Now, let me explain why this strategy matters beyond just the specific policy changes. What we're witnessing is the end of the post-World War II international order. After 1945, the United States built a global system based on collective security, free trade, and international institutions like the United Nations and NATO. The idea was simple. If countries cooperated economically and militarily, they would be less likely to go to war. And the United States would serve as the guarantor of that system, using its military and economic power to enforce the rules. That system worked for 75 years. Western Europe didn't fight another war. Japan became a peaceful democracy. South Korea went from a dictatorship to one of the world's most advanced economies. Global trade expanded, poverty declined, democracy spread. But the system also came at a cost. The United States spent trillions of dollars defending other countries. American troops were deployed to over 100 countries around the world. The U.S. fought wars in Korea, Vietnam, Iraq, and Afghanistan, often with limited support from allies. And American workers saw their jobs move overseas as companies took advantage of global trade agreements. Donald Trump campaigned on the idea that this system was a bad deal for America. He argued that allies were freeloading off U.S. military protection while refusing to pay their fair share. He said that endless wars in the Middle East were wasting American lives and money, and he promised that under his leadership, America would put itself first. The 2026 National Defense Strategy is the fulfillment of that promise. The document explicitly states the days of the United States propping up the entire world order like Atlas are over. That sentence is the epitaph of the post-war order. But here's the question no one in Washington wants to answer. What comes next? If the United States is no longer the world's policeman, who fills that role? Some analysts argue that allies will step up. Europe will build a stronger military. Japan and South Korea will take the lead in containing China. Middle Eastern countries will manage their own security. But that's wishful thinking. Europe is politically divided, economically stagnant, and militarily weak. Asian democracies don't trust each other enough to build a collective security system. And the Middle East is a powder keg of sectarian conflict, authoritarian regimes, and proxy wars. The more likely scenario is that rival powers, China, Russia, and regional actors, will fill the vacuum left by American retrenchment, and the world will become more unstable, more violent, and more dangerous. We're already seeing the early signs of this. Russia invaded Ukraine because it believed the West wouldn't respond strongly. China is building military bases in the South China Sea because it knows the U.S. is unwilling to fight over disputed islands. North Korea is testing intercontinental ballistic missiles because it sees that America's deterrence is weakening. And now, with the 2026 National Defense Strategy, the United States has officially confirmed what adversaries already suspected: America is stepping back. Let me give you 3 scenarios for what happens next. Scenario 1. Allies step up and the system survives. In this scenario, European countries dramatically increase defense spending, build integrated military capabilities, and create a credible deterrent against Russia. Japan, South Korea, and Australia do the same in Asia, forming a coalition capable of containing China without heavy U.S. involvement. The post-war order survives, just with different leaders. This is the best-case scenario. But it's also the least likely. Building military power takes years, sometimes decades. European countries would need to triple their defense budgets to match what the U.S. currently provides. Asian democracies would need to overcome decades of historical grievances and form a unified alliance. That's politically difficult and economically expensive. And even if allies succeed, the question remains: will they have the political will to actually use military force when needed? It's one thing to build weapons, it's another thing to send your citizens to die in a war to defend a treaty obligation. Scenario 2, regional hegemons emerge and the world fragments. In this scenario, the world divides into regional spheres of influence. China dominates Asia. Russia controls Eastern Europe. Regional powers like Turkey, Iran, and Saudi Arabia compete for influence in the Middle East. The United States focuses on the Western Hemisphere. This is essentially a return to 19th century great power politics, where major countries carved out zones of control and didn't interfere in each other's business. The problem with this scenario is that it's inherently unstable. Spheres of influence overlap. Regional powers compete for resources and influence. And when conflicts arise, there's no international system to manage them peacefully. History shows that multipolar systems are prone to miscalculation and war. World War I started because European powers misjudged each other's intentions and commitments. A similar dynamic could play out in a fragmented world order. Scenario 3, conflict escalates and wars become more common. In this scenario, the absence of American leadership creates a power vacuum that leads to increased conflict. China invades Taiwan. Russia expands into Eastern Europe. Regional wars in the Middle East and Africa intensify, and the risk of great power war increases. This is the nightmare scenario, but it's not implausible. Without the United States actively deterring aggression, countries that have territorial ambitions will be more willing to take risks. Taiwan is the most obvious flashpoint, but there are others. Russia could target the Baltics. China could seize disputed islands in the South China Sea. North Korea could invade South Korea. Each of these conflicts has the potential to escalate into a larger war. And without strong U.S. leadership, the international community would struggle to respond. Here's what you need to watch in the coming months. First, how do U.S. allies respond? Japan has already announced plans to massively increase defense spending. Germany is debating whether to develop its own nuclear weapons. Poland is building one of the largest armies in Europe. Watch whether these efforts accelerate or stall. Second, what does China do? If Beijing believes the U.S. won't defend Taiwan, we could see a much more aggressive posture in the Taiwan Strait. Military exercises, airspace violations, and naval blockades could all escalate. Third, how does Russia interpret this strategy? If Moscow believes NATO is weakening, it could probe the alliance's eastern flank. Watch for increased military activity near Poland, the Baltics, and Romania. Fourth, What happens to nuclear arms control? New START expires next month. If there's no replacement, we're heading into an uncontrolled nuclear arms race. That has profound implications for global security. And finally, watch the 2026 midterm elections in November. If Trump's Republican Party loses control of Congress, there could be pressure to reverse some of these policies. But if Republicans maintain or expand their majority, the 2026 National Defense Strategy will become locked in for years to come. Let me bring this all together. The 2026 National Defense Strategy is the most significant shift in American foreign policy since the end of the Cold War. It formally declares that the United States will no longer serve as the guarantor of global security. It downgrades China as a threat, abandons Europe to its own defense, and signals that Taiwan may not be a priority worth fighting for. For 75 years, American military power has prevented major wars between great powers. That era is now over. What comes next is uncertain. Maybe allies will rise to the challenge and the international order will survive in a different form. Maybe the world will fragment into competing spheres of influence, or maybe the absence of American leadership will lead to more conflict, more instability, and more wars. We're about to find out. Subscribe to this channel and turn on notifications because 2026 is shaping up to be one of the most consequential years in modern history. The world order that has kept the peace since 1945 is collapsing, and no one knows what will replace it. This is the conflict room. Stay informed, stay vigilant, and watch what happens next.